In a storm-battered Vermont estate, silence had ruled for years. Ethan and Elias, two young boys, had not laughed since the night their mother died. Their father, Alexander Hawthorne, a billionaire weighed down by grief, buried himself in business, believing money could shield them from loss. But one evening he came home early, and everything shattered. Through the downpour he saw them, his sons in his old red jerseys stomping in puddles, laughter piercing the rain. At their center was Marissa, the quiet maid he had barely noticed, her voice rising above the thunder. "Come on, boys! Let the storm wash your fears away," she cried. Alexander's voice cut like a blade. "Enough! What madness is this? Look at them soaked, filthy!" The boys froze. Then Ethan, tears streaking his face, shouted back, "Dad, do you even remember how to smile?" The words struck harder than the storm. Alexander faltered, seeing his sons clinging to Marissa, their laughter mixing with sobs. That night, as lightning split the sky, he stood in the doorway of their candlelit room. Marissa spun a story of a clumsy giant who hated wet socks, every thunderclap just his angry complaint. The boys laughed until fear melted into joy, and in that moment, Alexander saw the truth. His home was being healed not by silence, but by love he had almost lost forever. Support us by subscribing and share in the comments. Where are you listening to this story of resilience tonight? Autumn in Northfield, Vermont did not arrive with a shout, but with a sigh. The hills that rolled away behind the town were tinged at their edges with the cautious orange of maples and the first tired yellows of birch. A slow drizzle tapped at windows, slipping down in uncertain rivulets, the kind of rain that softened even stone houses and made the air smell of iron and leaves. Beyond the town proper, where antique shops and a modest church steeple stood like polite reminders of an older century, the road bent upward through tall grass and oaks toward Hawthorne Estate. The mansion, 3 stories of brick and white columns, did not crouch into its surroundings. It presided, austere as a courthouse, its windows reflecting the gray sky like unwilling eyes. From the outside it looked complete. Inside, however, silence had become the most permanent resident. The owner of the house, Alexander Hawthorne, was a man of 51, tall, broad-shouldered, his presence still carrying the weight of boardrooms and decisive votes. His hair, once a dark, confident brown, had given way to iron gray along the temples, streaks that made him look sterner than he often felt. A faint scar ran just below his chin, the remnant of a college baseball accident, but it only emphasized the square determination of his jaw. His eyes were the pale, watchful blue of winter morning, sharp when speaking to shareholders, but hollow when turned toward the walls of his own house. He dressed impeccably, as though armor might still matter in rooms where no battle remained to be fought. Charcoal suits, crisp shirts, shoes polished until they reflected the chandeliers above. Alexander had once been known for warmth. His late wife often said that when he laughed, the whole room leaned in. But since the accident, since the night everything had shattered on a dark highway, laughter had deserted him. His goal now was singular: protect the empire he had built, the company that bore his name, for it promised him stability in a world that had stolen everything unpredictable. But beneath that pursuit was a quieter terror, that in saving his company, he was losing his sons. Ethan and Elias, the Hawthorne twins, had been 7 for nearly 3 months, though their eyes carried the weight of older children. Strangers struggled to tell them apart. Both had the same fair hair that fell in careless waves, the same pale skin prone to faint freckles, and the same long lashes that shadowed hazel eyes. Yet difference revealed itself to those who stayed long enough to see. Ethan, born 9 minutes first, wore his seriousness like a second shirt. He leaned into conversations, into the wind, into silence itself, as though bracing against storms only he could sense. His speech was careful and sparse, his silences clenched and private. He noticed hands before he noticed faces, reading something in the way fingers moved or failed to move. Elias, slighter by a pound, carried patience like a lantern. He was left-handed. His letters curved awkwardly, yet earnestly across paper, each one shaped as if it were listening. His silences were not clenched but flowing. They reflected whatever hovered above them and then moved on. Together, the boys had forged a language adults could not translate. Glances across a room, shoulders leaning close, tiny gestures of understanding that kept them tethered to one another when the world felt unreliable. Since their mother's death, laughter had fled them as surely as it had fled their father. They ate mechanically, played without abandon, slept as if surrendering to the night were dangerous. They lived, but they did not glow. The staff of Hawthorne Estate had learned to reduce themselves to whispers. Mrs. Dwyer, the cook, 60 and kindly heavy-set, carried flour in her cuticles, as though it had lived there all her life. She believed in soups that acted as nouns, comfort, patience, strength, and kept biscuits in tins as if they might someday be called as witnesses. She hummed old Irish ballads while stirring, but never too loudly, as if the house itself forbade enthusiasm. Joel, the groundsman, in his 40s with a baseball cap from a minor league team long defunct, tended the gardens with a ranger's devotion. He spoke to the hydrangeas as if they were jurors, convincing them to bloom in unkind weather. Even Duke, the aging Labrador who had once dozed in the mudroom beneath a bowl painted with his name, had been sent to live with cousins in Montpelier when the house proved incapable of shouldering the noise of affection. Life at Hawthorne Estate was a performance in half-tones, careful not to wake grief, but not everyone allowed themselves to shrink. Marissa Cole, the housemaid, carried her presence with a quiet steadiness that refused to vanish. 32 years old, she was tall and slim, with skin the deep, rich brown of roasted coffee beans and eyes that held a calm authority. Her hair, usually bound neatly in a head wrap while she worked, fell in soft curls on Sundays when she allowed herself the luxury. She did not speak much in Alexander's presence, not from fear, for he was always courteous in the measured way of wealthy men, but from respect, knowing grief was like wet paint and easily marred. Her hands were deft and unflinching. She could remove a splinter without causing pain, coax a broken hinge into obedience, and fold clothes so precisely it felt like an act of devotion. Townsfolk described her as good with children, which meant she remembered that children were people, not projects. What no one in the house knew, not even Mrs. Dwyer, was the burden she carried. Her younger brother, Michael, 26 and once the strongest boy in his class, now lay in a hospital bed battling an illness that demanded endless money. Marissa worked here not for luxury, but for survival. Each paycheck was bent toward medical bills. Each hour of labor a step on a staircase she prayed would end with Michael walking again. Yet she never allowed that weight to seep into the way she treated Ethan and Elias. To them she gave warmth unannounced, the kind that came in small mercies, a mended toy, a blanket warmed by the fire, the right story told at the right time. She did not try to cure their sadness. She tried to make it livable. That morning, drizzle tapped the windows in soft apology, and the mansion yawned itself awake reluctantly. Mrs. Dwyer had already left for a dental appointment, leaving behind a plate of banana bread under foil and a note written in schoolteacher handwriting. Warm 12 minutes at 300. Give the boys the ends if they ask. They always do. Marissa smiled at the certainty of the last line. She moved about the house with her cart, flats whispering against hardwood floors, the air scented faintly of lemon polish. In her cardigan pocket, folded 4 times, was the hospital's latest notice. The payment plan revised yet again, numbers written with the cool indifference of mathematics. She did not look at it. Morning belonged to the boys. She collected small artifacts that proved life still persisted here. A Lego head rolled under a chair, a lone sock adventuring behind the couch, a pencil that had rehearsed the letter S so obsessively it looked like a snake dance. Passing the upstairs gallery, she paused at the family photographs. Emily Hawthorne, Alexander's late wife, glowed in them with a radiance that needed no apology. Tall, with hair the color of sunlit chestnut, she had a smile that opened whole rooms. In one frame she was caught mid-laugh, ankle-deep in a creek with both boys clutched by their hands, all 3 squealing at cold water that wasn't nearly as cold as they pretended. Marissa always greeted her softly, "Morning, Mrs. H," before moving on, as if aligning herself with the memory that still commanded the house. At the twins' door she knocked twice, pausing long enough for dignity. Silence answered, as always. She entered to find Ethan and Elias bent over desks, pencils poised, worksheets as intimidating as treaties. Ethan glanced up first, eyes scanning her expression for weather. Elias stayed bent over his page, shaping letters. "Breakfast in 10, Marissa announced. "And before you say you're not hungry, banana bread has a clause. It's for people who are hungry and people who aren't. It tells the truth in both languages." Ethan's mouth twitched, almost betraying a smile. Elias peered over his page. "Is there butter?" "There is butter," she said solemnly. "And there is the good butter." "What's the difference?" Ethan asked. "The good butter remembers the cow by her first name." Elias chuckled, a small, unguarded sound like the bell of a bicycle far away. Marissa didn't chase it. She never chased laughter. She bowed out, leaving the door ajar in that perfect way that meant you are trusted and I am near. Downstairs, Alexander already sat at the kitchen island, portfolio open, 2 phones nearby, one buzzing with the heartbeat of markets, the other silent but accusatory. He had returned from Boston late, slept briefly, and showered himself into acceptable order. His tie was disciplined, his coffee black. He looked up when Marissa entered, nodding with polite detachment. "Morning." "Morning, sir." "The boys?" "Awake. Banana bread will defend them." His mouth twitched again, not quite humor, but not dismissal. "Long day," he muttered, meaning board meetings, reports, shareholders. "Yes," she replied, meaning hospital bills, the boys, the absence that weighed down every corner. They let silence stand between them like neutral ground. When the boys arrived, barefoot and solemn, Marissa slid plates toward them. Blue cloth under Ethan's, green under Elias's, because color was a promise. They did not need coaxing. Ethan inspected his slice as if studying a jewel. Elias pressed butter until it melted into small golden maps. Alexander attempted conversation. "How's the week?" he asked to no one in particular. "Spelling list is waiting," Marissa offered, "and the library sent a note about a book that isn't late but feels late." "We'll return it," Alexander said quickly, grateful for solvable tasks. "And there's a permission slip for the field trip," she added. "It needs a signature and a belief in buses." "Buses," he repeated, as if testing a foreign word, then signed the paper without fanfare. When his pen lingered over the line marked emergency contact, his eyes dimmed for a moment before he wrote a name with deliberate care. Later, as drizzle thinned to mist, the boys settled in the library. Ethan built a lopsided citadel from wooden blocks, each tower leaning like an apology. Elias read aloud from a field guide about birds, his voice steady. "A cedar waxwing can pass a berry from beak to beak down a row," he reported, "like sharing the sun." "Good teamwork," Ethan replied. "Friendship," Elias corrected. "Also sticky," Ethan added, and for the first time both smiled at once, unaware of the rarity. Marissa, watching from the doorway with her duster, recorded it silently in her private ledger of mercies. Alexander appeared at the threshold, pausing as if the room had become holy ground. He did not enter. He observed, swallowing a lump in his throat, before quietly retreating. Evening approached early in Vermont, fog spilling onto the lawn. Mrs. Dwyer returned from town with groceries and grumbled about dentists who praised gums like gardeners. She produced chili and cornbread, feeding the household with the authority of a queen who ruled by nourishment. The boys accepted apple slices with the seriousness of monks receiving sacraments. Alexander thanked her awkwardly, his voice caught between gratitude and pride. After dinner, Marissa guided the twins through reading. She sat cross-legged on the carpet, not instructing but witnessing, while Ethan tamed a paragraph and Elias whispered about migration patterns. When grief caught in Elias's throat, she rested 2 fingers lightly on the page, reminding it of patience. Alexander stood unseen in the doorway, unable to step into the sanctity of the moment, afraid his presence might break the fragile magic. He watched until he could no longer, then turned away, carrying silence like a fragile relic. By nightfall, the rain retreated to the gutters, murmuring like a tired guest. The boys brushed teeth, water dripping rhythmically, then slipped into bed with Marissa's gentle precision blankets not too tight, water glass within reach, door left ajar at the perfect angle. "You are safe. I am near." On the landing, she paused at Emily's photograph, her laughter frozen in a creak, and allowed herself a single private breath. Downstairs, Alexander sat at the kitchen table, staring at the signed permission slip. In the box that asked for anything we should know, he had written without thinking, "They are brave. Please be gentle with their bravery." He set the pen down as though it were sacred. In the mudroom, white paper streamers the boys had taped earlier fluttered above the door frame, tracing the invisible paths of wind. Alexander watched them tremble and did not remove them. Evidence of what moves us, he thought, is worth keeping. Outside, fog lingered across the lawn. Inside, the house settled, quilts tucking themselves around its sleeping children. For the first time in months, Alexander admitted the truth he had long avoided. His goal was not stability, it was not profit or survival, it was simply this, not to lose again. And as he sat in the hush of Hawthorne Estate, the silence no longer felt absolute. Somewhere, faint and surprising, it contained the echo of laughter. The afternoon sky over Northfield had turned the color of slate, the sort of heavy gray that announces its intentions before the first drop falls. Clouds pressed low against the Vermont hills, rolling in with a weight that made the town's streets look deserted and the forest edges blur into watercolor smudges. By 3 o'clock, the drizzle that had whispered through the morning gave way to sheets of rain, striking the windows of Hawthorne Estate as though testing its resolve. Wind pushed through the maples in great restless sighs, sending leaves to their deaths early, plastering them against glass and stone. Inside the mansion, the atmosphere had sunk into its usual muted order. Alexander Hawthorne had left his Boston office earlier than his calendar approved, surprising even himself. The boardroom debates had dragged, numbers and projections clattering around him without meaning, and he felt a sudden ache, part weariness, part impulse that drew him back to Northfield. His driver, Patrick Hayes, a man in his late 50s with thinning silver hair and a belly pressed against his uniform jacket, had served him for over a decade. Patrick was steady, respectful, and possessed the quiet patience of a man who had once raised 4 children on a factory wage before switching to private service. He spoke little, preferring to keep his eyes on the wipers that struggled against torrents of rain. Patrick carried the faint smell of tobacco and peppermint, a habit of chewing mints after quitting cigarettes 20 years earlier when his youngest daughter begged him to stop. As the car curved up the long gravel drive, rain struck the hood so hard it sounded like a drum line. Alexander stared out of the tinted window, expecting stillness, silence, the usual mood of the house that greeted him like a museum at dusk. But what he saw when the vehicle crested the rise was not silence. The rear gardens were alive, trembling with movement. Through the streaming glass of the window, he caught sight of figures, small, frantic, joyful figures. He frowned, heart clenching in confusion, and told Patrick to stop at the side entrance. Without waiting for an umbrella, Alexander stepped into the storm. Rain soaked his shoulders instantly, plastering his suit against his frame. He strode toward the gardens with the gait of a man preparing to discipline, but as he neared, the sound that reached him was not the usual hush. It was laughter. High, breathless, unrestrained laughter, so rare he almost didn't recognize it. In the middle of the sodden garden, Marissa Cole stood drenched. Her cardigan clung to her like ivy, hair loosed from its coil into dark spirals that glistened against her cheeks. Water ran down her arms, but she seemed unconcerned, her face lifted to the sky in a radiant grin. Beside her darted Ethan and Elias, each wearing oversized red shirts. Alexander's old college rowing jerseys pulled from storage that hung on them like banners. The boys ran in circles with watering cans now redundant in the downpour, tilting them dramatically over roses already drinking their fill. They shouted with glee, mud spattering their bare legs, laughter ringing through the downpour with a force that pierced the storm itself. Alexander stopped in the archway of the terrace, both stunned and unsettled. His first thought was discipline. Clothes ruined, garden trampled, children soaked in dangerous weather. His second thought, unwelcome, was awe. The sound of their laughter real, unguarded, bright, was a sound he had not heard since the day before Emily died. The contradiction struck him like a blow. Anger at Marissa's disobedience of his rules and gratitude for a miracle he had thought lost. His hands clenched at his sides, unsure whether to step forward and end it or stand still and let it continue. Ethan saw him first, mid-spin, and froze. His laughter snagged in his throat. Elias, still shrieking with joy, nearly collided with his brother before noticing the figure on the terrace. Silence fell, thick and immediate, broken only by the storm. Marissa turned at last, eyes locking on Alexander's. For an instant her expression faltered, guilt, defiance, and something softer passing all at once. Then she straightened, rain dripping from her chin, meeting him without flinching. He stepped forward, voice tight. "What is this?" Marissa's voice, though quiet, carried through the storm. "It's living, sir." The words struck him harder than a reprimand. He looked at his sons, shirts plastered to their skin, cheeks flushed, eyes alive in a way he had almost forgotten they could be. His anger was real, but it battled with something else, something dangerously like hope. Meanwhile, in the kitchen earlier that day, the storm had begun to whisper of its arrival. Mrs. Dwyer, returned from her errands in town, had prepared a pot of stew and was fussing at the windows. She muttered that children would catch their deaths if anyone dared let them outside in such weather. But Marissa had watched the boys all morning, restless at their desks, pencils tapping against worksheets with no conviction. She had seen Ethan glance longingly at the blurred outlines of the garden and Elias trace raindrops on the glass with his fingertip. When the rain intensified, instead of locking them away from it, she had opened the back door. Marissa believed storms were not curses, but baptisms. In her childhood, her grandmother, Dorothy Cole, a wiry woman who had raised 7 children alone in Georgia, used to send her grandchildren outside during summer downpours, telling them the sky was washing away yesterday's troubles. Marissa had been a thin-legged girl, hair in wild braids, and she remembered vividly the feel of mud squelching under her toes, her grandmother's voice calling, "Dance with the rain, it will leave you cleaner than fear." That memory, branded into her bones, guided her now. So she had wrapped the boys in Alexander's old jerseys found folded in the laundry, too big but warm, and led them into the storm. At first they hesitated, unsure if laughter was permitted. Then one of them, Elias, tilted his watering can skyward, water spilling uselessly, and burst out laughing at the absurdity of it. Ethan followed, and suddenly the garden was filled with life again. As Alexander stood dripping on the terrace, torn between fury and something he dared not name, another figure appeared at the side door. Clara Maddox, the deputy from the local sheriff's office, had come by to return a misplaced document regarding the estate's property lines. Clara was 32, compact and sturdy, with auburn hair cut short to her jawline. She had a straightforward manner, the kind of woman who could still an argument with a glance. She paused in the doorway, umbrella dripping at her side, watching the scene unfold. Though technically only a visitor, Clara had known Marissa from town events, and she recognized at once what was happening. Children reclaiming something stolen by grief. She said nothing, choosing silence over interruption, before quietly leaving the folder on the kitchen counter and slipping back into the rain. The moment remained suspended. The roses bent low under water, the boys' chests heaved with breaths caught between joy and fear, and Marissa stood calmly, daring Alexander to decide what mattered more, rules or resurrection. His heart hammered. He wanted to shout about recklessness, about pneumonia, about appearances. But another voice whispered in him, the memory of Emily, dancing barefoot with the boys under a summer shower, her laughter blending with theirs. He had scolded her then for soaking their clothes, and she had only smiled. "Clothes dry, Alex. Childhood doesn't." Now, facing Marissa, the words haunted him. His jaw worked, but no rebuke emerged. Instead, he turned sharply, retreating into the house, leaving behind the storm and the sound of children who had briefly remembered how to be alive. The rain did not end quickly in Vermont. Storms here lingered like guests reluctant to say goodbye, hanging about the eaves with a stubborn patter. By nightfall, Hawthorne Estate lay under a heavy curtain of drizzle, the gardens washed clean but raw, the roses bowing under the weight of too much water. Inside, lamps glowed with an amber determination, each one trying to soften shadows that did not want softening. Dinner had been quiet. Mrs. Dwyer had placed stew on the table, thick and honest, and the boys had eaten with the kind of calm hunger storms sometimes bring. Marissa moved lightly between them, towel still damp from drying their hair. Alexander said little. His eyes kept wandering to the windows where drops slid like restless spirits, as if the storm outside had migrated into his chest. Later, when the house withdrew into night routines, the boys brushing teeth, Joel securing shutters against the wind, Mrs. Dwyer humming in the kitchen as she dried the last pan, Alexander climbed the wide staircase alone. His steps were heavy, but deliberate. At the top, he paused at the gallery where Emily's photographs hung. One in particular caught him. Emily in the rose garden, a straw hat tilted, gloves muddy, laughter caught mid-turn as though she'd been surprised by the camera. The roses around her had been brilliant, scarlet blooms she coaxed from stubborn soil. Now, seeing them in memory while outside the storm bent the living ones to the ground, he felt something fracture. He turned away sharply, retreating into the library. The library was a cavern of dark wood and dust-scented air, a place where knowledge sat like stone but comfort rarely visited. Alexander shut the heavy door and lit a single lamp, its glow spilling across the desk where papers lay scattered but ignored. On the mantel sat a framed photograph of Emily, smaller than the hallway portraits but more intimate. She was holding the twins, one on each hip, sunlight behind her turning the edges of her hair gold. Alexander stood over it for a long moment, chest tight. His mind replayed the scene in the garden hours earlier, his sons drenched but laughing, Marissa standing radiant in the storm. It unsettled him. He wanted to be furious, to call it recklessness, but the sound of that laughter gnawed at his defenses. It was proof of life returning, and he did not know whether to welcome it or fear it. If he opened himself to it, he risked losing again. If he shut it out, he would steal the last of his children's childhood. The choice made him feel like a ghost haunting his own house, pacing corridors where only echoes answered. He pressed his palms against the desk, breathing heavily, wondering if he had already become a relic present, yet absent, alive but spectral. Down the hall, the house had quieted. In the twins' room, two small bodies curled under blankets. Ethan, ever the cautious one, clutched a stuffed bear with one arm, jaw set even in sleep as though defending some invisible boundary. Elias sprawled more loosely, his left hand still resting on the page of a book, as if the story might finish itself while he dreamed. Marissa, who had tucked them in, lingered in the doorway longer than usual. She noticed the bear, seams carefully stitched where she had mended it weeks ago, black thread against faded brown fur. That tiny detail caught her off guard. The boys trusted her repairs, not only of toys, but of moments too fragile to name. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling in the hush. She slipped into the hall and answered. The voice on the other end was clinical, rushed, the hospital. Her brother Michael's condition had turned. The doctors recommended immediate surgery, urgent, costly, unavoidable. Marissa pressed her back to the wall, phone clutched tight. Her mind raced through numbers, bills already overdue, wages stretched thin, savings non-existent. She thanked the doctor, promised she would speak to the finance office, and hung up. For a long while she stood there, staring at the rain against the glass. Michael had always been the strong one, tall, wiry, a grin that could disarm even their grandmother's sternest moods. He had been the one to walk Marissa home after late shifts at the pharmacy when they were younger, telling jokes that made her forget how dangerous the streets felt at night. Seeing him frail, diminished by illness, was like watching a tree collapse in the forest. She wanted to fight for him, but every option seemed to demand a sacrifice. And now, with the surgery looming, The arithmetic of survival tightened around her. She thought of leaving Hawthorne Estate. There were rumors of better-paying positions in Burlington, a private clinic seeking staff, a hotel in need of managers. It would mean abandoning the safety she had built here, the fragile trust of the twins. Yet what choice did she have? She pressed her fingers to her forehead, fighting tears. Then she remembered the boys' faces, wet and radiant in the storm that afternoon. She remembered how Elias had laughed at the butterclaws that morning, how Ethan had finally let a smile escape when teasing about sticky berries. And now, sleeping, they held close the bear she had sewn back together. Her chest ached with the realization. She was bound to them in ways she had not admitted, perhaps even to herself. Walking away would not just be abandoning a job. It would be tearing herself from a family she had stitched into her own broken edges. In the library, Alexander lowered himself into a leather chair, head bent. His hands trembled slightly, not from age but from the war between memory and fear. He thought of Emily's roses, how she had insisted on planting them herself, though the groundskeeper warned the soil was unfriendly. She had dug anyway, laughing, gloves filthy, declaring that beauty always demanded risk. He thought of the day he had scolded her for letting the boys play in the rain, and how she had turned with eyes bright, answering, "Clothes dry, Alex?" Childhood doesn't. Now her words came back like a ghost, echoing through Marissa's defiance earlier. He realized with dread that silence was not preserving his children. It was erasing them. If he did not act, he would lose them in a different way. Still breathing, still here, but locked away behind walls of caution he himself had built. He pressed a hand to his face, whispering into the empty room, "Emily, what do I do?" Only the rain answered, steady, unrelenting, like the voice of time itself. By midnight the estate was still. Joel's flashlight traced one last circle around the stables before winking out. Mrs. Dwyer's snores carried faintly from her quarters. Marissa, lying awake in her small attic room, stared at the ceiling. She imagined Michael in a hospital bed, pale and waiting. She imagined the twins clutching her hand in dreams. She imagined Alexander, alone in the library, wrestling with ghosts. Her life was divided into these fragile pieces, each demanding loyalty, none willing to wait. The storm outside finally began to ease, thunder rolling away toward the mountains. The house seemed to breathe, a sigh after a long-held note. But inside its walls, the struggles remained unspoken, unresolved, alive. The storm that had haunted Northfield 2 nights before had left behind a countryside raw with water. Puddles lingered in the gravel drive like forgotten mirrors, and the hawthorn gardens carried the damp perfume of roses struggling to lift their heads. The air was crisp with late autumn chill, the kind that seeps into stone houses and lingers there. By mid-afternoon, clouds began gathering again, heavy with rain, and the estate seemed to brace itself. Alexander Hawthorne had spent the day in his study, wrestling with contracts and the whispering insistence of markets. His reflection in the window looked more spectral than human blue eyes, tired, gray streaks harsh under the weak light. He had not forgiven what he had witnessed days earlier, his sons and Marissa in the garden storm, laughter replacing silence but chaos replacing order. He told himself he valued discipline, structure, safety. Beneath that, though, was fear, that yielding to joy would mean yielding again to loss. When he finally rose from the desk and walked toward the back of the house, it was the sound, not silence, that drew him. Peals of laughter again, sharper than before, echoing off stone. His chest tightened. He strode to the terrace doors and flung them open. In the sodden yard, Ethan and Elias were leaping into puddles, water arcing around them like liquid crowns. Their shirts, red jerseys still too large, were streaked with mud, their legs splattered. Marissa stood with them, hair damp from drizzle, encouraging them with a soft, clapping rhythm. She looked not like a maid in that moment, but like a conductor of small miracles, orchestrating laughter against the weight of grief. Alexander's voice tore across the rain. "Enough!" The boys froze, eyes wide. Marissa turned slowly. Rain slid down her cheek, mingling with a single tear she had not meant to show. Alexander's anger flared, sharpened by the memory of Emily's last words about childhood and by the weight of his own ghosts. "What is this chaos? Look at them, filthy, soaked like beggars in my garden." His voice cracked the way storms do when lightning threatens. The twins' faces crumpled. Elias clutched Ethan's sleeve. Ethan stepped forward, shoulders trembling, but his voice was unsteady. "We were just—" Alexander cut him off, turning to Marissa. "You defy the order of this house. You think recklessness is care? You undo everything I have tried to preserve." He felt the tremor of his own fear spill into fury. "Pack your things. You will leave Hawthorne Estate tonight." For a moment, silence returned, heavier than the rain. Then Ethan and Elias collapsed into sobs. They rushed to Marissa, clinging to her soaked skirt, their small hands grasping as though holding her might hold the world together. "No, don't go," Elias cried, face buried against her leg. Ethan's voice cracked through tears, raw with desperation. "She's the only one who makes us laugh." Marissa's lips parted, but no words came. Her throat burned, yet she remained silent. Her eyes, dark and steady, met Alexander's across the rain. They did not plead, did not explain. They only held a quiet defiance, a faith that love did not require permission to be true. Tears blended with raindrops on her cheeks, but her gaze never wavered. It was Ethan who broke the storm open. His voice, rising above sobs, hurled a question sharp enough to pierce through armor. "Dad, do you even remember how to smile?" The word struck Alexander like a physical blow. His breath caught, his mouth shut as though locked. He saw his sons' faces through the veil of rain, saw their small bodies clinging to Marissa, and for the first time in years, he felt the crushing truth. Perhaps he had forgotten. Earlier that day, while the clouds still gathered, Marissa had carried out her routines. She folded laundry with precision, ironed shirts that Alexander might never notice, and swept hallways where silence echoed louder than dust. In the twins' room, she found Elias sketching a bird on loose paper, Ethan arranging Lego blocks into what looked like walls rather than castles. She had suggested they step outside, into the drizzle, to breathe something beyond grief. The boys had hesitated, but their longing betrayed them, and soon they were stomping through puddles with abandon, their laughter rising like sparks. Her decision was not without weight. That morning she had spoken again with the hospital. Michael's surgery was confirmed. The cost, unbearable. She had paced her small attic room, phone clutched in hand, considering jobs whispered about by acquaintances in town. But then she heard the boys through the thin walls arguing softly, voices subdued but alive, and her resolve faltered. She knew she was tied to them more tightly than she had expected. She wanted them to know joy again, even if she could not guarantee it for herself. So she led them outside, where puddles reflected a sky too gray to judge them. Back on the terrace, the confrontation hung like thunder between Alexander and Marissa. Joel, the groundsman, had appeared at the edge of the garden, cap pulled low against rain, his tall frame tense but unmoving. He was a man of few words, usually gentle with the earth and with children. His eyes flicked from Alexander to the twins, but he did not interfere. He respected boundaries, but even he felt the wrongness in the air. The boys' sobs echoed. Marissa bent slightly, brushing wet hair from Elias's forehead, her hand trembling but sure. She whispered something too soft for Alexander to hear, but it quieted the younger twins' cries for a moment. Ethan, however, did not release her. He turned his tear-streaked face toward his father, repeating through clenched teeth, "Do you even remember?" Alexander's chest heaved. The rain blurred his vision, or perhaps it was his eyes. He wanted to shout again, to reaffirm control, but the image before him, the twins desperate, Marissa steadfast, the garden alive with water, held him motionless. The roar in his ears was no longer the storm outside, but the storm within. For the first time in years, he felt utterly powerless. The storm announced itself long before the lights surrendered. Clouds had been stacking since evening, thick as cathedral walls, until the sky collapsed in on itself. Rain hammered Hawthorne Estate with an iron persistence, sheets of water running down the tall windows and seeping through the cracks of the old stone like time reclaiming its due. Thunder boomed across the Vermont hills, shaking even the chandeliers that had survived a century of guests. Then, just past 9, the power snapped off. The house fell into darkness so sudden it seemed as though breath had been stolen from its chest. Only the storm outside remained, furious and relentless. Mrs. Dwyer cursed softly in the kitchen, her voice muffled as she fumbled for matches. Joel, the groundsman, moved about with a flashlight, checking the stables where horses stamped nervously at the noise. The twins, Ethan and Elias, startled by the blackout, clung to each other at first. But Marissa Cole moved swiftly, lighting candles from a box she kept tucked in a drawer, her hands steady, though her heart was racing. One candle after another bloomed into flame until the hallway flickered with small golden halos. Shadows leapt across the walls, alive, almost playful. Alexander, who had been brooding in his study, stepped out to the side of the house rearranged by firelight. His blue eyes caught the glow, hollow and uncertain, as though unsure how to measure this new kind of illumination. He said nothing, only tightened the knot of his robe and walked the corridor. His mind still burned with the memory of the garden days before, his boys soaked in mud, Marissa defying him, Ethan's accusing question. Do you even remember how to smile? That question clung to him like burrs, impossible to shake off. He paused at the sound of voices ahead. Not ordinary voices, but something lighter, warmer. He followed the sound toward the twins' room, footsteps hushed against old wood. Inside, Marissa had gathered Ethan and Elias onto their beds, covers pulled up but forgotten. Candles flickered on the nightstand, casting amber crowns on their heads. The storm outside roared with renewed force, a sharp crack of thunder rattling the window. Elias flinched, covering his ears. Ethan tensed, jaw set. Fear crept over their small faces, the kind that had lived in them too long. Marissa leaned forward, voice gentle but animated. "Do you know why the thunder sounds so loud tonight?" she asked. Both boys shook their heads. She widened her eyes in mock seriousness. "Because there's a giant stomping about in the hills." But he's not angry. He's just forgetful. He hates wet socks. Every time he steps into a puddle, he grumbles and shouts, and that's what you hear. Elias's hands slipped from his ears. Ethan's brow furrowed, torn between doubt and curiosity. Marissa continued, using her arms for flourish, her voice rising and falling like a seasoned storyteller. Imagine a giant with enormous boots but holes at the toes. The poor fellow forgets every time it rains, and then, splash, into a puddle he goes. His socks soak through and he bellows, "Oh, not again!" That's the thunder you hear. Not danger, just one very clumsy giant. A flash of lightning lit the room. For a moment the boys froze. Then, when the thunder rolled right behind it, Marissa exaggerated a stomp with her foot, groaning, "Blast these soggy socks!" The twins burst out laughing, a laughter that tumbled freely, unforced, their eyes wide not with fear, but with delight. Elias giggled so hard he nearly tipped over, while Ethan covered his face with his hands, laughter leaking out through his fingers. In the doorway unseen, Alexander stood rooted. The scene before him was drenched in light and memory, the laughter of his son's real, unbroken spun back time. He was no longer in the dim candlelit room, but back under a summer rain years ago, Emily at his side. She had insisted on walking without an umbrella, twirling it above her head instead of using it, laughing as the boys splashed in puddles. She had pressed against him, hair wet, eyes bright. "Clothes dry, Alex." Childhood doesn't. The memory slammed into him, stealing his breath. Now, watching Marissa, he saw the same spark, the courage to defy sorrow, the gentleness to make fear ridiculous instead of terrifying. Something cracked open in him, something long buried. His throat tightened until he thought he might choke. He clutched the doorframe, afraid that if he stepped inside, the fragile spell would vanish. The boys had collapsed back onto their pillows, cheeks flushed from laughter, still giggling at the idea of a giant stomping around Vermont hills in ruined boots. Elias leaned against Marissa's arm, whispering, "Do you think he'll ever buy new shoes?" She smiled softly. "Not if he keeps forgetting, sweetheart. That's why we forgive his noise." Ethan let out another laugh, shaking his head. Marissa herself felt something stir. She had told the story to calm them, but in spinning the giant's clumsiness into humor, she realized she was soothing a younger part of herself as well. The girl who had once hidden under blankets during storms, terrified, until her grandmother sent her outside to dance in the rain. Her own wounds, raw and long ignored, were being salved in the same rhythm of laughter she gave the twins. For the first time in years, she felt healing press back against her chest, fragile but undeniable. Alexander's eyes shimmered, though the candlelight might have been blamed. He whispered Emily's name under his breath without meaning to. The storm outside bellowed again, but inside it sounded different now. Less threat, more background, like the clumsy complaints of the giant Marissa had invented. His sons did not cower. They leaned into the story, into safety, into laughter. Alexander realized with sudden clarity that the fortress of silence he had built around them had not been protection at all. It had been a prison. And Marissa, with nothing but her voice, had shown them the key. He wanted to step forward, to thank her, to kneel by his children and let them see he remembered how to smile. But he stayed at the threshold, motionless. The moment felt sacred, too delicate to risk breaking. So he remained in the doorway, listening, watching, his heart cracking open to something he had long denied himself: hope. The storm raged on outside, but inside, the darkness had been transformed. Shadows danced in candlelight, laughter outshouted thunder, and for the first time in years, Alexander allowed himself to believe he did not have to run from love. Morning came slow and pale after the storm, as if the sky itself needed to remember how to breathe. Mist lingered over the Vermont hills, curling above the grass like steam from an unseen kettle. The air was cool, washed clean, carrying the smell of earth turned soft by rain. At Hawthorne Estate, the house seemed quieter than usual, not with grief, but with a kind of watchful pause, as though waiting to see if the previous night's fragile magic had been real. Alexander Hawthorne rose before the sun fully claimed the sky. He stood at his wardrobe, hand brushing over suits lined in neat ranks, but his eyes settled on something folded far back on a shelf. A red jersey, worn soft with age, its seams faintly frayed. It was one of the shirts his boys had worn in the rain, oversized, ridiculous, yet somehow triumphant. He hesitated, then pulled it over his shoulders. The cotton was loose, smelling faintly of cedar from the drawers, and in its wrinkles lay memories of a younger man, a younger father. He looked in the mirror and did not see a billionaire or a widower. He saw a man still capable of choosing. Downstairs, Ethan and Elias were already awake, rubbing sleep from hazel eyes, their hair messy with curls. They padded into the hall, still in their pajamas, and stopped short when they saw their father in that jersey. For a moment they said nothing, unsure if it was a ghost of the man they remembered or the real one standing before them. Alexander held out a hand to each of them. "Come," he said quietly. "We've work to do." Their small fingers slipped into his, cautious at first, then firmer. Marissa was in the kitchen, tidying up after breakfast, when she looked up and saw the trio at the doorway. She wore a simple white blouse, sleeves rolled above her elbows, dark trousers already dusted faintly with flour. Her eyes widened at the sight of Alexander's red shirt, but she said nothing. She only nodded, slipping a shawl around her shoulders and following them out to the garden. The rose beds were still damp from rain. Some blossoms were battered, petals scattered like confetti across the soil, but green shoots stood resilient. Joel, the groundsman, was already there, tall and wiry in his work jacket, hands resting on a spade. His cap was pulled low, shadowing a weathered face that rarely revealed much, but when he saw Alexander leading the boys, a flicker of surprise crossed his features. He gave a small nod and stepped back, letting the family claim the ground. Alexander knelt on the soil, not caring about the damp seeping into his jeans. He pulled off his leather gloves, choosing instead to feel the raw earth. Ethan and Elias crouched beside him, eyes shining with an eagerness that had been absent for too long. Marissa moved gracefully, handing them seedlings from a wooden crate Joel had prepared earlier, new rose bushes, tender and waiting. The children dug clumsy holes with small trowels, mud caking under their nails, but their laughter came bright and easy. Alexander pressed a root ball into the ground, covering it carefully, tamping the soil with his palms. He looked at Marissa, saw her kneeling opposite him, dark curls falling across her forehead, eyes intent on the work. "Emily loved these roses," Alexander said softly, almost to himself. The boys looked up. He rarely spoke their mother's name aloud. "She said they would outlast us if we tended them with care." Ethan's lips parted, words caught in his throat, but Elias reached out and patted the mound of soil. "Then let's make them strong, Dad," he whispered. They planted in silence after that, the kind of silence that heals, rather than wounds. The air carried the faint metallic sound of trowels, the thud of earth, the rhythm of breathing together. By noon, a new row of rose bushes stood, fragile but hopeful, their leaves trembling in the cool breeze. When the last plant was settled, Alexander stood, brushing dirt from his hands. He looked at Marissa, who was tying a stake to support a young stem. Her clothes were streaked with mud, her face glistened with sweat, but her posture was proud. He cleared his throat. "Marissa." She looked up, startled by the weight in his tone. "Your brother. I will cover his expenses, the hospital bills, the surgery. All of it." Her eyes widened. For a moment she froze, as though she had misheard. "Sir, you don't have to." "I know," Alexander interrupted. His voice was low but certain. "I choose to." He glanced at the twins, who were watching silently, dirt on their cheeks, eyes wide with hope. "You have done for my sons what no one else has been able to do. You reminded them how to laugh. That debt is greater than money." Marissa's lips trembled. She swallowed, blinking back tears, and bowed her head. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice cracked, but it carried the weight of years of fear lifting from her shoulders. At that moment, the wind shifted, carrying a cooler current through the garden. A small wind chime that had hung neglected by the back porch stirred for the first time in months. Its notes were soft but clear, ringing like silver bells over the new roses. The boys laughed and ran to it, reaching up to make it sing louder, their giggles echoing across the estate. Alexander watched them, chest tight with something he had not felt in years. He turned to Marissa. Candlelight from last night still haunted his memory, her voice transforming thunder into humor, fear into laughter. Now, under the daylight, she stood before him not as a servant but as part of the home itself, as essential as the roses. His eyes burned, moisture threatening, but he let it be. From the terrace, Mrs. Dwyer appeared, arms crossed over her apron, lips twitching into a smile she did not bother to hide. Behind her padded a dog, the neighbor's spaniel, a russet-furred creature named Toby, who had wandered onto the grounds. Toby was middle-aged, his muzzle graying, eyes warm and pleading in the way only dogs can manage. The twins rushed to pet him, laughing as he shook rainwater from his coat, spraying droplets across their clothes. Mrs. Dwyer chuckled. "That mutt's been sneaking into the pantry when Joel leaves the door cracked." Guess he knew there was life in this house again. Even Joel, leaning on his spade, allowed a smile. As afternoon tipped toward evening, the family lingered in the garden. The roses, newly planted, caught the last of the light. Ethan and Elias ran barefoot through the damp grass, Toby chasing them, tales of laughter trailing behind. Marissa tilted her head toward the chimes, eyes closed briefly as though memorizing the sound. Alexander stood a step behind, watching it all, his heart raw and unguarded. The Hawthorne estate, once smothered in silence, now hummed with voices and bells, with footsteps and laughter. It no longer felt like a mausoleum of wealth, but like a house beginning again. And Alexander, standing in the midst of it, realized his truest purpose was not to guard money or to avoid pain. It was to guard this fragile, defiant joy, to never let it slip from his hands again. Morning came slow and pale after the storm, as if the sky itself needed to remember how to breathe. Mist lingered over the Vermont hills, curling above the grass like steam from an unseen kettle. The air was cool, washed clean, carrying the smell of earth turned soft by rain. At Hawthorne Estate, the house seemed quieter than usual, not with grief but with a kind of watchful pause, as though waiting to see if the previous night's fragile magic had been real. Alexander Hawthorne rose before the sun fully claimed the sky. He stood at his wardrobe, hand brushing over suits lined in neat ranks, but his eyes settled on something folded far back on a shelf. A red jersey, worn soft with age, its seams faintly frayed. It was one of the shirts his boys had worn in the rain, oversized, ridiculous, yet somehow triumphant. He hesitated, then pulled it over his shoulders. The cotton was loose, smelling faintly of cedar from the drawers, and in its wrinkles lay memories of a younger man, a younger father. He looked in the mirror and did not see a billionaire or a widower. He saw a man still capable of choosing. Downstairs, Ethan and Elias were already awake, rubbing sleep from hazel eyes, their hair messy with curls. They padded into the hall, still in their pajamas, and stopped short when they saw their father in that jersey. For a moment they said nothing, unsure if it was a ghost of the man they remembered or the real one standing before them. Alexander held out a hand to each of them. "Come," he said quietly. "We've work to do." Their small fingers slipped into his, cautious at first, then firmer. Marissa was in the kitchen, tidying up after breakfast, when she looked up and saw the trio at the doorway. She wore a simple white blouse, sleeves rolled above her elbows, dark trousers already dusted faintly with flour. Her eyes widened at the sight of Alexander's red shirt, but she said nothing. She only nodded, slipping a shawl around her shoulders and following them out to the garden. The rose beds were still damp from rain. Some blossoms were battered, petals scattered like confetti across the soil, but green shoots stood resilient. Joel, the groundsman, was already there, tall and wiry in his work jacket, hands resting on a spade. His cap was pulled low, shadowing a weathered face that rarely revealed much. But when he saw Alexander leading the boys, a flicker of surprise crossed his features. He gave a small nod and stepped back, letting the family claim the ground. Alexander knelt on the soil, not caring about the damp seeping into his jeans. He pulled off his leather gloves, choosing instead to feel the raw earth. Ethan and Elias crouched beside him, eyes shining with an eagerness that had been absent for too long. Marissa moved gracefully, handing them seedlings from a wooden crate Joel had prepared earlier. New rose bushes, tender and waiting. The children dug clumsy holes with small trowels, mud caking under their nails, but their laughter came bright and easy. Alexander pressed a root ball into the ground, covering it carefully, tamping the soil with his palms. He looked at Marissa, saw her kneeling opposite him, dark curls falling across her forehead, eyes intent on the work. "Emily loved these roses," Alexander said softly, almost to himself. The boys looked up. He rarely spoke their mother's name aloud. "She said they would outlast us if we tended them with care." Ethan's lips parted, words caught in his throat, but Elias reached out and patted the mound of soil. "Then let's make them strong, Dad," he whispered. They planted in silence after that, the kind of silence that heals rather than wounds. The air carried the faint metallic sound of trowels, the thud of earth, the rhythm of breathing together. By noon, a new row of rose bushes stood, fragile but hopeful, their leaves trembling in the cool breeze. When the last plant was settled, Alexander stood, brushing dirt from his hands. He looked at Marissa, who was tying a stake to support a young stem. Her clothes were streaked with mud, her face glistened with sweat, but her posture was proud. He cleared his throat. "Marissa." She looked up, startled by the weight in his tone. "Your brother. I will cover his expenses, the hospital bills, the surgery, All of it. Her eyes widened. For a moment she froze, as though she had misheard. "Sir, you don't have to—" "I know," Alexander interrupted. His voice was low but certain. "I choose to." He glanced at the twins, who were watching silently, dirt on their cheeks, eyes wide with hope. "You have done for my sons what no one else has been able to do. You reminded them how to laugh. That debt is greater than money." Marissa's lips trembled. She swallowed, blinking back tears, and bowed her head. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice cracked, but it carried the weight of years of fear lifting from her shoulders. At that moment the wind shifted, carrying a cooler current through the garden. A small wind chime that had hung neglected by the back porch stirred for the first time in months. Its notes were soft but clear, ringing like silver bells over the new roses. The boys laughed and ran to it, reaching up to make it sing louder, their giggles echoing across the estate. Alexander watched them, chest tight with something he had not felt in years. He turned to Marissa. Candlelight from last night still haunted his memory, her voice transforming thunder into humor, fear into laughter. Now, under the daylight, she stood before him not as a servant but as part of the home itself, as essential as the roses. His eyes burned, moisture threatening, but he let it be. From the terrace, Mrs. Dwyer appeared, arms crossed over her apron, lips twitching into a smile she did not bother to hide. Behind her padded a dog, the neighbor's spaniel, a russet-furred creature named Toby, who had wandered onto the grounds. Toby was middle-aged, his muzzle graying, eyes warm and pleading in the way only dogs can manage. The twins rushed to pet him, laughing as he shook rainwater from his coat, spraying droplets across their clothes. Mrs. Dwyer chuckled. "That mutt's been sneaking into the pantry when Joel leaves the door cracked." Guess he knew there was life in this house again. Even Joel, leaning on his spade, allowed a smile. As afternoon tipped toward evening, the family lingered in the garden. The roses, newly planted, caught the last of the light. Ethan and Elias ran barefoot through the damp grass, Toby chasing them, tales of laughter trailing behind. Marissa tilted her head toward the chimes, eyes closed briefly as though memorizing the sound. Alexander stood a step behind, watching it all, his heart raw and unguarded. The Hawthorne estate, once smothered in silence, now hummed with voices and bells, with footsteps and laughter. It no longer felt like a mausoleum of wealth, but like a house beginning again. And Alexander, standing in the midst of it, realized his truest purpose was not to guard money or to avoid pain. It was to guard this fragile, defiant joy, to never let it slip from his hands again.